Oh, I might enter the wrong Zoom link.
No, you're all set.
Okay,
We're just the first couple of people here.
okay, thanks.
Wait, is this discussion section?
Nope, this is the correct link for the lecture. We're just the first few people here.
Ah, I see. Thank you.
minds. Like, they ask me
Okay, everybody, we can go ahead, I think, and get started. If you are ready to go, let's go. Okay, having some internet things today. Can everybody hear me okay?
The same like first 10 seconds.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
I'm
Thank
alive.
you.
I'm live.
So I would love to just sort of see how everyone's doing, check in. We're starting, this is our 7th lecture, so we're starting our 4th week of class. Yeah, so yeah, just want to see how things are going. Did you have a nice weekend? Those kinds of things. Anderson's shaking his head. Can you tell us what you did over the weekend, Anderson?
Yeah, I went in. My girlfriend came over, and we had some nice long walks outside because it was really nice weather in I'm in Western Mass, so
Okay.
so that was kind of nice, a nice little break from constantly being logged in.
Yeah, logged in and kind of also kind of locked in. Yeah. Well, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Makes me happy. Any other cool things this weekend go on with you guys?
Sorry, not this last Monday, but the Monday before that. The episode of a show I've been waiting for, 12, like this specific episode, it's an anime, so it went into like my favorite chapter of the manga. It finally came out, but I kept putting it off until Sunday when I finally sat down and watched it, and it was absolutely amazing. I was really excited.
It was all you hoped for and more.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, considering it's
And-
been something I've been waiting for since I was 12.
Wow. So what's the manga or the anime or whatever? What's it called?
Fruits Basket.
Oh, you mentioned it that to, the first
Yeah.
couple classes. Yeah.
It's their
Okay.
play, sort of Cinderella.
Okay. Is it available like on Netflix, or do you have to like have some sort of a subscription, or how did you get it?
I watched it on Crunchyroll. Yeah,
Okay.
I watched it on
I don't know what that
Crunchyroll,
is,
but I
but-
know Funimation also has it.
Okay. Well, I will check it out hopefully soon. I'm glad that you enjoyed your long-awaited series and that it's out. That's always a nice feeling. Especially now that we're like inside so much. So speaking of entertainment and series and stories, I would like for you to pull up your essays, maybe if you have them printed out, or if you have them on a separate window on your computer. But I want to talk about the essay a little bit before we do anything else. So if you could do that, take a second and do that. And I'll watch to see if people are done pulling up their things. Okay. So I always like to ask students at the beginning of this kind of book discussion to talk a bit about how they felt about the book. So overall, you've had a chance now to read hopefully the whole book beyond the first 100 pages. I kind of just want to ask you, what did you think of the book? We talked a bit about a couple of things. You mentioned, Ellie, that the last time that the book was not just from the point of view of the victors, and it was an unusual perspective. And now you've had a chance to keep reading. So yeah, just some comments about the book. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I liked
And you
how
Is that
sorry.
Allie?
Yeah.
Sure.
I liked how I like understood the language, and I felt like it like translated well to like the way that we speak today, which I would like not imagine for something that's like 200 years old or whatever. Like I feel like I understood the perspective of like Shibaguro and stuff. So it wasn't like super dense, and I also like I feel like the way we view like poverty and like traumatic events is a lot different than how they viewed it in that culture. So I liked the comparison from like older times Japan to like modern day America.
Yeah. So interesting points there. First of all, that the language was not quite as different as you might have perhaps expected. that I think it speaks to sort of, the universality of human experience. There are a lot of things that are different in cultures and times, but humans are humans, and people are people, and this is we can, I think, see the humanity of this person very clearly. So thank you for that. And the poverty. So like, what about the poverty for you, Ali, is sort of, and the way it's viewed in this context is different than how we see it today.
I feel like the culture of kind of like, well, your duty is to like serve your parents. Like there was like a portion of that in the book, and how like Shibaguro tried really hard to like follow that like doctrine, even when he was faced with like, I mean, like the part where they had to like cut off his top knot and he had to like dress like a peasant and stuff. Like I just feel like that the attitude was more like, I have to deal with this, rather than like I don't know, like it just seemed like I was like that. And I think I don't know, it goes to the like collectivist society back then too. I don't know, I just thought it was like slightly different how it was kind of like, okay, we have to endure this even if it means like eating dog meat and stuff like that. But I guess that's still translatable to this day and age for individuals in extreme poverty. Sorry, that was rambly.
But I think that there's a mentality that you're pointing to, which is one of like, we have to survive, we have to do this, right? And we have to, for the sake of our family unit and our domain, we have to do this, which I think perhaps is different than today, right? People perhaps are more in poverty today, are dealing with terrible things, especially right now in the COVID context, right? But they're not thinking about their state, or that needs them to put on a brave face, that kind of thing. So that's, I think, an interesting point. Yeah, thanks for that, Ali. Other thoughts about the book? I'm gonna make sure I can see everyone here. If you can just sort of raise your hand, I can call on you. Yeah, Sam.
What I liked more about the book, from reading other biographies and other things, is how reflective Shiroguro is in it, because he's not just writing this, as it's happening, like thinking like, oh, he's taking the time to explain and think and reflect on like how he views events compared to how they're contextualized in other sources, and he really puts that into his story about, well, this is what happened, they don't write about this, or like, this is what I saw, but people say this happened in some instances, which I thought was very interesting, gave you a very large overview of like what was happening.
Yeah, thank you for that. I get that. This is a memoir as opposed to sort of a diary or even autobiography. It's a memoir, and so it is thinking back on their life in the context of what they know has happened since. So it does give us, I think, a really great perspective, and that makes it interesting and informative. Yeah. Other ideas? Wells, yeah.
So I liked the fact that, considering that it was written from the perspective of like the loser, they didn't win in the whole war thing. You learned a lot about like samurai culture because of how like stoic they were in defeat, and how like they sort of accepted it in a way that was like very telling about that era in Japan, I felt.
Yeah, so you got to really see like into their their values and their ideals and what was most important for them, and it really comes through in hardship, right? They're really still clinging to these values. Yeah. So let me ask you another question. Historical narrative, is it's typically, we're trying to explain, we're trying to tell a story, right? And a story, it may jump around, but in theory, it's going to have sort of a linear feel to it, right? There'll be a beginning and an end, there'll be a cause and at least, or there'll be an impact and a repercussion. And there's this sort of this linear quality to historical narratives. I think that it's possible to see Shibaguro's memoir as a reflection of like a non-linear or unlinear or challenge to our historical narrative. So I wanted to ask you this is a hard question, but if you have any thoughts on how this memoir is able to teach us about historical sort of complexity, and challenge the linearity, if you will, of historical narratives. Alexandra, yeah.
Yeah, something that doesn't really get mentioned a lot in just like a textbook is empathy, and kind of it'll talk about what people go through, but as I'm so sorry, I'm completely forgot who just spoke, said, history isn't often from the loser's perspective. And there's this certain amount of covering up of suffering that history textbooks tend to do, by kind of shoving that under the table and saying, oh, but these people won, look at how great they won. But when you read something from the person's perspective, especially when the time that they were going through this as a child, like they were a child at the time, there's just that added connection you feel to this person. You're like, oh, that's an actual human being, not just a statistic.
Yeah, I mean those are some, I think, really great points. One of the things we think about as historians is what are the points that make up your narrative, and over if you do like modeling or some sort of, if you do equations, sometimes you're always forced to sort of go with the overarching most representative curve or line, and in history that line typically is where it follows people who win, right? They have the most resources available to us. They have their voices are usually the loudest, and so this other perspective of the losers is oftentimes lost, and because of that, we can't, as you mentioned, empathize. We can't really appreciate what their experiences were, or perhaps even consider their experiences at all, right? And here we get that. Very, very well said. Other ideas about sort of the challenges this text is making on a linear, black and white, good bad kind of narrative. Yeah, Ellie.
Well, that's not exactly connected to that, but one thing that I found very interesting about the piece is that in the introduction, it specifies that while the experiences, the core story, and the original manuscript were written by Hibagoro himself, the actual narrative storyline was really put together by another person. And so I thought that was an interesting fact, because a lot of these memoirs, while they may have had like other people editing them or such, but to have the actual bulk of the literary part of it to be done by someone else, I thought was interesting.
Yeah, so this is actually, it's a journalist, right, who interviewed him over several, poof, and she's gone, and she's back, over several, a serialized, right, publication. And so they were able to sort of take the story in interesting directions. And that does definitely affect the nature of the narrative. And, perhaps it also makes it somewhat linear, right? That there is sort of a chronological feel to it, and it does sort of come together quite well. Perhaps himself, right, trying to write this story, he died in 1945. Himself writing this story would have been perhaps not quite so well told, or at least told differently. So yeah, a good point. I saw that Jack raised his hand.
Yeah, I liked that it wasn't like a linear story, because like at times it could provide like a greater context to like what he was talking about, since he could jump around. And it kind of reminded me of Slaughterhouse-Five, which is like another like sort of non-linear historical biography slash fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to read stories that kind of shake up the basic narrative framework a little bit, and this is an example of that. And I've never had anyone link Slaughterhouse 5 to Shibagoro, but I can go with that. So thanks for that, Jack. I think Ferris had his hand up too.
Yeah, so kind of like the point I wanted to make is kind of to like branch off of what Alexandria was saying in terms of that human element, because in terms of like the historical context and significance of the event, I think it's very important to understand how that clearly affects Shibagoro specifically, because you know, as he's remembering these things as a child, it's kind of interesting to see how the end of that era and kind of the entering of this new era kind of affects his whole livelihood and his family, and also kind of shows again like that loser perspective of it's kind of like this you like I don't know how to really explain it, but it's kind of like this story of like this great time in history, right? And then all of a sudden this change comes in and the people who benefited before just get struck down and is kind of now at the bottom. And it's kind of cool to see that perspective of like being on top for so long and kind of seeing that shift down to like of like it's like that stripping of class that I find really interesting, and kind of how that affected his life as a child and kind of his family overall.
That's actually really interesting. I've never thought of, I haven't in this class discussed it from that point of view, that this is sort of a story of like a sort of, you know, like a fall from grace of an entire class, right? And we get to see that through his eyes. And so while we talk a lot about the Meiji Restoration and how that it was a positive thing for many people in Japan and moved Japan towards more wealth, modernization, and those kinds of things, don't necessarily discuss the fact that it was not just difficult, but it was a topsy-turvy, right, maneuver that put the samurai class suddenly, at least the ones who were on the wrong side of the restoration, in a terrible position of having to fight, you know, for their livelihoods, but without any swords. And this kind of struggle, I think, is it's sad, but we get to see it really well through this book. That's really well said. So what I asked you guys to do for the essay was to think about how Japan has been changing, using my lectures, using the textbook, using the lectures that are recorded, a few of the ones that are recorded, and use that as sort of a backdrop, and then pull things from Shibagoro's memoir that really embody those changes. And so what I want to do next for about 10 minutes is just get into groups and talk about, you know, how you, so like which major changes you identified, and then how we see them in life of Shibagoro. So in your groups, try and come up with, you know, a couple of major changes that you maybe all agree upon, and a couple that were different, and how they show up in for you, how the life story of Shibagoro reflects those changes. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms. It's going to assign you to them randomly, but that is your task. Okay? All right. Let's see. Okay.
Garrett. I just tried to join a breakout room and it just kicked me out of Zoom.
Okay. Let me try and just put you in a room and see what happens. Okay, so try again. Okay. Okay, it looks like we're mostly all back here. Welcome back. Thank you for taking some time in the breakout rooms to discuss your essays. I'd like to hear from a few groups how some of the things that you came up with and whether they were the same or different. So I'm kind of just going to look at names here and see who I want to call on. Is it Kiara or is it Ciara?
It's Kira.
Kira, okay. So yeah, would you tell us a bit about what your group discussed in terms of the changes happening in sort of mid 1860s Japan and how Shibagoro's life manifested those changes?
Yeah, so we talked about like the postal service, and personally I talked about foreign chain. And I talked about how like the silk immediately once foreign trade was open, it tripled in its like demand and price, and that led to like the overthrow kind of, or that was one of the pieces that led to it. Tied that into Shibagoro because that ultimately led to the overthrow of the Bakufu, which led to him living in sorry, I'm like struggling with the volume. I also talked about schooling because Shibagoro like talked about how they switched from traditional Confucius writing over to just more general writing. And what else did we talk about in the group? Yeah, the postal service was definitely a big economic change. And just one more thing. But yeah, that was generally it.
Those are some really good like concrete changes. As I kind of walked around the room virtually, I heard some sort of big picture background things happening, which is great as well. But it's good to have those kinds of concrete changes that you can directly link to the life of Shibagoro. That makes a good essay, it makes for a good argument, and it makes eventually for a good narrative. So thank you for those. Those were fantastic. How about Khalil? In your group, can you talk a bit about what your you and your breakout room classmates discussed in terms of changes in Japan and how they impacted Shibogoro's life?
Our group, we discussed the changes in like the social caste system, at least within the region of the Aizu for the most part, how the samurai generally lost power and that led to displacement among samurai families. We also talked about how the Bakufu, like that balance of power was upset by the arrival of Western powers and the different intentions of the Western nations and the Japanese factions within Japan and what they wanted to do with the Western nations and so forth.
Okay, that was very succinct. We've got, I think, some common threads here of the impact of Western trade, Western sort of interaction, and also the class system being so dramatically changed as well. All right. How about Angela? How about your group?
In my group, we talked about how the removal of the samurai really affected everyone, and just like basically what happened to the samurais. And we also just talked about the Western powers and their influence on Japanese people.
Okay, so some good basic contours of change on how they applied. Okay, so that was a chance to sort of see what you guys come up with. I look forward to reading some of those, and I think Devin will be reading these as well. He will surely look forward to reading them as well. Every year, we get students who have different answers to the same questions. It's always very interesting to see what you guys come up with. So I look forward to that. So I want to finish class today with a PowerPoint that will build off of the reading that was due for today, as well as for the excerpt of the recorded lecture that is up on Moodle. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to go to PowerPoint mode in a few seconds. Okay. So if you'll recall, we talked briefly about the changes that were going to be coming and sort of changing Japan. We talked about taxes, we talked about education and schooling, we talked about these very concrete changes. One of the things that you seem to have mostly picked up on your at some level in your essays is the impact of the West. And we talked last class mostly about the arrival of Westerners in Japan, but then how they were also sought after to help Japan make it on their charter oath. This new Meiji government promised to do these 5 things, and the seeking of knowledge throughout the world was an important priority for them. But I want to talk for the last bit of class about the Iwakura Embassy and embassies in general to the West. We have this image of Japan, we call it Japan, the Sakoku, or the closed country. And we talked a bit in class about how that's not accurate. It was more Japan was closed to the West, except for the trade with the Dutch. But already from the 1850s, we have a much more internationally aware shogunate. The shogunate was getting the Times of London, to read on a pretty regular basis in the 1860s, and had tutors to read it to him. So that it was not, Japan was already at the highest level of government, thinking about the West and how to engage with the West and what the West could teach Japan. And so I want to sort of trace the line that leads up to the Iwakura Embassy of 1871, beginning with the first Japanese trip to Europe in 1860. The shogunate sends an embassy to the US in 1860 and then to Europe in 1862. And both of these trips are short and not very in-depth trips. They're their first time that they have sort of official diplomatic encounters with the U.S. And Western Europe in Europe, so to speak. So they get to see a little bit, but they're really sort of there to have a conversation and to expose themselves to the cultures of the other countries. One of the things that they're also there to do is they're there and take part in the in 62 and the in a great exhibition, a World's Fair, and to sort of visit the Japan booth, right, and help sort of try and demonstrate Japanese culture to Europeans. So there is this sort of early contact that we see. And 67 is the World's Fair, excuse me. So the World's Fair in 67, they've already gone back home, the travelers who were part of the embassy, but the government then sends people to man this World's Fair booth, essentially this display. And so it's part of this longer process of trying to expose the West to Japan and to sort of show that Japan is not a backwards country. If we think back to the arrival of Commodore Perry and the kinds of images that Europeans, Western Europeans, and Americans had of Japanese, they thought of them as quaint, although intelligent, and not very advanced in terms of technology. And so the early encounters are an effort to sort of actually try and showcase the beauty and the depth of Japanese culture. They were not trying to show off Japan's technological might, anything like that, at this early juncture. In 1871, the new Meiji government that has now overthrown the shogunate sets off on this massive trip, and we discussed this very briefly last class. We had a chance to read about it for today, but this is just it's a tremendous opportunity for Japan to learn from the West, and you have to sort of imagine what this meant for Japan. This was, half of the government, as well as over 50 students and other high important individuals who go along with the officials, and they all go to try and absorb all they can from the West. This is the Japanese, when they arrived, everything was crazy, right? They on the ship over from Yokohama, they had to eat American food, and they wanted fish. They couldn't have fish. They very strange smells and of the food, and also the people who, let's face it, were not as clean as the Japanese. And when they arrive in the United States, the looks of Americans at seeing Japanese arrive. But at this point, there's very little immigration from Japan to the United States happening sort of under the radar. That will pick up after this point. But the Japanese are sort of a novelty for Americans. And one of the stories that we can talk about a little more in depth today is the story of the 5 young girls who also were chosen to go along with this mission from age of 7 to the age of 18. I'll get to that in a second, but these girls and young women are going to actually be, they have the opportunity to be the carriers of American sort of culture back for women in Japan, and a couple of them actually are very influential in that vein. But I mentioned a few of these things last class, right? We're talking about trying to understand all the technologies and the systems and the institutions that are in place that make the West, it's a sort of monolithic West for Japan, so successful. And they travel so much that they get tired, right? They're just, it's a relentless schedule of meeting with diplomats and then going to visit actual sites. They're taking notes and notes and notes. And as you may have noticed in the article, in the book chapter for today, the official historian of the group, Kume Kumitaki, is actually taking notes on all this. And they're all taking notes, in fact, but he will actually then later write up all this into a document to help recall all that they've seen, so they can use that to help think of how they would like to change Japan, to improve Japan. And so all these things are, again, just vastly important. And Emperor Meiji and also the Meiji Empress are both very interested in what the youth on this trip can bring back to Japan. And in fact, the 5 girls who were chosen, they're all from the samurai class, and they're all from families that are trying to find a way to catch up again now that they have, like Shibagoro, gone through this tumultuous period. And these young women are given this sort of departure speech from Emperor Meiji before they left. So, I mean, this is a lot to take in, and it's also in a very formalistic kind of language. But in a nutshell, what is the Meiji Emperor trying to tell these young women and girls to do? What is their mission as part of the Okura Embassy?
I guess to gain more education so that they can model what Western women are doing.
Okay, so more education, very important point, and to model. That's a very good point as well, right? So women are supposed to get education not because it makes them better people, right? Or because it's going to fulfill their purpose in life or whatever it might be. It's so that they can help Japan, right? And they can model this. And one of the important things we talk about in other classes that deal more with things like imperialism, in this time period in particular, is that civilization was measured in large part by men according to women, right? And how women were treated in Japan, how they carried themselves, how educated they were. Japanese believed that this was going to be sort of a marker of civilization for them. And so they needed women to really showcase that they were cultivated and civilized. And this was this is what they could do by going to America. This last part here about, mothers on future generations almost wholly rely for the early culture. So this part here, I want to talk about that a little bit. What is this last part of this sort of imperative talking about in terms of the mission of these young women and girls?
Oh, is that
Ellie? Yeah.
is that like one of the things that the government had been doing a lot during this time to a much larger degree than it had before is very much like centralizing the power and trying to make like a national identity where there hadn't necessarily been a very united one before. And so I think like obviously mothers are perceived as like the ones who will like bring up the next generation, so to speak. And so if they have the proper education to raise children who can be loyal and useful to the state, then that for society will be like a net positive force for the future. Like it's very much future looking at like these kids will be the next leaders, and so we need to make sure that they are raised right in order to have like a strong foundation for society.
Yeah, that was really well put, right? So, and this is telling women that their purpose is in large part to become mothers who will raise the next generation, who will provide the early cultivation, which is education, for the youth who will then become good Japanese, right? And who will make Japan stronger and wealthier and give Japan a higher status in sort of the international hierarchy of nations. So this is the kind of thing that the girls were told, and they really, I think, took this to heart and went to Bryn Mawr. They went to live with different families, and then I'm going to actually just talk about one figure, Tsuda Umeko. She was actually just turned 7 on the way over. She lived in the US actually for 12 years. And then when she came back, having already been in high school in the United States over on the East Coast, she was a prime minister's tutor. She returns back to the US to go to Bryn Mawr. And then when she goes back to Japan permanently, she she establishes sort of the first women's, I don't know, it's not quite a college yet, but it's sort of a pre-college institution called Suda English School. And she also will become the first Tokyo YWCA president in 1905 or 1906. So she is going to be one of these figures who mirrors in some ways the efforts of Fukuzawa Yukichi, who we'll discuss a little bit later, to bring westernization, but the right kind of westernization to Japan. Does someone have a question? Okay, we're getting towards the end of the class, so I'm going to go to the next slide here briefly and talk about the vice ambassador. So the second in charge, who also has a very detailed journal of 3 volumes that talk about his trip. And here we can see just how important it is for him, in his view, for Japan to create schools that are going to make Japan stronger, and it's going to improve the life of the public in Japan, and are going to make Japan civilized. And this term civilized is going to be used again and again, and as well as enlightenment, as well as used again and again. The pairing in Japanese is bunmei kaika, or civilization enlightenment. This is the most important goal for education, but also the ties to that, to political power and unification, centralization are also very palpable as well. And you notice that he says that that Europeans and Japanese are in fact not that different, and he believes that the Japanese can get catch up to the West. So we'll talk next class about some of the figures who are going to be leading this new movement of westernization in Japan, and we'll talk also about some of the elements in society that are going to be trying to have their voices heard. This new government is actually quite elitist. It is quite it is sort of, let me stop the share. It is definitely still the samurai class in charge, but just a few members from a few domains, from Satsuma and from Choshu in particular, who are running the show, as opposed to the shogunate. But they, it's a more modern Euro-American directed or looking perspective, trying to achieve modernization, westernization, but it is still very elitist. And so what we'll see next class is the ways in which people are trying to change that and really broaden the government of Japan to make it one of the people, for, but also of the people as well. So I think we'll stop there for today. Thank you all. And I'm not going to actually be here in person next class. I have things to do at the same time. So you'll have a lecture you can watch on Moodle. It's a recorded lecture, and then I will see you all next Tuesday. So keep in touch. Thank you, and have a good evening or afternoon for you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye, thanks.
So are we still coming back to the Zoom link on Thursday? Or are we
No.
watching it on our own?
Yeah, it's asynchronous, so you can watch it on your own time.
Okay. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks. Take care, Daniel.
I had a question. Looking at that end quote, is because I'm trying to figure out. So they left in 71, and then that quote's from 72. Had they already seen Britain at the time for that quote?
So in January 72, they let's see, they were already. So they were in. So the U.S. was 6 months. Where were they in January 72? I think they did the U.S. last. Is that possible?
I think from the reading,
No, I
it
think
seems
it's
like
U.S. is first.
Yeah, I think they went U.S. then
US
Europe.
First. So at this point, let's see, they left September. So they have not been to Europe yet.
Okay, I'm just wondering because I was wondering more of from the quote.
Yeah.
If I wonder if they had changed the delegation, looking at all the poor poor sections, because I feel like that was emphasized in the reading, was just how much like they went through like the back alleys and everything, and the vice and everything. And I was wondering if more of they realized like that that class of people were very uneducated because they only worked and everything.
That's a great question. So they kind of realized that the Americans are very good at showing the Japanese like the best stuff,
Yeah.
for a long time. But the British are not interested in the Japanese, and so they kind of give them free reign. The Japanese visit things sort of on their own itinerary to some extent. So they do see more of the working class in Wales and in England and in the Midlands. And that does sort of, on the one hand, it makes them realize that, Japan and with its own problems, surely of class and status and economics, are not so different from the West, or the West is not has not achieved an unattainable level of success. But it also underlines like the ways that Japan can improve in these areas, and where perhaps Europe is failing even, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good point that you make there, and this is they come to this realization while they're in the UK, and they go to the UK I think in February or thereabouts of '72, and begin to see those things. So
okay. Yeah, that's what I was curious about, because that's what I also took away from it, is that as much as the West is like saying, oh, look what we can do, like they see, oh, they do have all these things, but it hasn't spread as far as like they're claiming it has. That's what I definitely took away. And I think that one chapter said like the red carpet treatment was what was happening, like, oh, look at all these things. And then I think the reading from yesterday from that we were supposed to read also said like that the British were more interested in definitely having the Japanese more of like as commerce, like selling products, not ideas, like the US is trying to kind of do in a way. The US is trying to do in their original diplomatic mission there first with their agreement. So
that I think that's totally accurate. So you've got that,
I
think, straight.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks. See you in a bit, Sam.
Yeah, see you in a little bit.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. So, let's meet. I'm gonna try and be here at let's say at 45. So 45, 1:45 on Thursday, and I will have prepared what I want to talk to you about in terms of the essay. If you look at them before then and you have questions, that's fine. If not, I think that it'll be pretty straightforward. And if you have questions about other things that have been going on, like over the past couple of weeks that you want to talk about, we could have a little bit of time then. And then if we are like still needing to talk more, we can set up a time probably to talk on Friday. We can see when you're available, and set up a meeting.
That sounds good.
Okay. All right. So have a good afternoon, Devin, and I will see you. I just realized, wait, no, we're not going to meet on Thursday. Of course not. Let's see. So, okay, it doesn't work anymore. Let's see what could work. What is your schedule like before and after class, usually on Thursdays?
Checking right now. So before the usual class time on Thursday would be better for me, because then I have a seminar right at 2:30.
Okay.
After class time, so I can meet for that half hour between 2 and 2:30, or really any time in the morning.
In the morning for you? Okay, so you're free in the morning as well on Thursday? You said? Like what time in the morning might work for you?
Really any time between 9 and noon my time. It's wide open.
Okay, so let me email you to confirm, but probably sometime like maybe like 10-ish. We can talk about the essays.
That sounds good.
All right.
All right.
And you're doing a great job with with fielding questions and also with finding my slip ups. So thank you for that. And keep it up. And I look forward to talking to you around 10 probably on Thursday.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Devin. Bye.